Welcome to join this book discussion. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening for you from different parts of the world. I am Carol. I'm currently located in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, so it's actually morning for me when I'm giving out this book club. And today we want to focus on this book with this title, The Extended Mind, The Power of Thinking Outside the Brain. It was published in June 2021, so it's a relatively new book and it was written by Annie Murphy Paul. She is a science writer and also she was one of the keynote speakers in TIES 2022. So, a little bit about myself. I am currently an MYP math teacher at American International School Vietnam, AISVN. This year, 2021-22, is my 6th year of international school teaching. I am originally from Taiwan and I have lived in 4 countries so far: Taiwan, the US, Canada, and then right now, Vietnam. And the following bullet points are how I define myself. I am an avid reader. Even when I'm busy with my work and personal life, I try my best to finish 1 to 2 books every month. And I was trained as a classical musician, as a pianist, and a mezzo soprano when I grew up. So music is still a huge part of my life right now. And then I am a passionate traveler. My annual traveling was interrupted by the pandemic in the past 2 years, though. But I'm slowly picking up my travel routines this year. And the most important one, I think, is that I am a lifelong learner. I am always curious about the unknown territories and try to figure them out. So, this is me. Okay, so here's a bit of housekeeping before we get started. Let's get connected with each other by switching on our cameras. And feel free to use the chat box or simply turn on your microphone to share your thoughts or questions throughout this session. And just a quick reminder, if you're sharing your thoughts in the chat box, don't forget to click on everyone mode so we can all see your beautiful thoughts. And then finally, this session has been developed independently and it is not endorsed by the IB. And let's get social. If you're using one of the following social media platforms, please don't hesitate to share what you learned from this session with the rest of the world. Okay, so before we delve into some interesting ideas from this book, let's take a few minutes to reflect on these 3 questions. So the first one is, what words would you associate with effective thinking? And the second is, how would you respond to mind-body binary, which is believed to be rooted in Western culture? As Paul, she herself mentioned this binary several times in the book. And then finally, a little bit personal, what brought you to this book discussion club or sharing? Okay, let's take 3 minutes for our personal reflection and then we're going to share together either in the chat box or through the microphones. So, for me personally, I always try to be effective and efficient in my daily activities. I sometimes struggle with slowing down and letting other parts of my body to take control over my thinking. And for the second question, I don't know. I haven't been stuck in this binary. I think it is because of my background in musical training. Producing music without connecting the mind and the body is simply impossible, unimaginable to me. And for the third question, I was intrigued by Annie Murphy Paul's keynote speech during the TIES conference, and her argument in this book really speaks to my current reading thread, i.e., how to use neuroscience to enhance my teaching and students' learning. Okay, let's move on. So, here is the outline for our discussion for today. I want to first introduce you to the author. If you haven't got the chance to attend her keynote speech or watched her recording on the TIES platform, she also has a really interesting personal website to showcase her recent TED Talks and some notes for extending our reading experience of this book. And I really encourage you to take a look at that. Following that, I will share some intriguing passages from these three parts of the book: the body of the mind, the body and the mind, the environment and the mind, and the people and the mind. So, if you have read this book, you can use these passages and some guiding questions to reflect on how you processed this book. If you haven't picked up this book, I hope that these passages can be an invitation and inspiration for you to read this book very soon. At the end of this session, we want to think about how this reading experience can bring some changes to our daily teaching. I feel like we really need a lot of superpower when we cope with, I call it the post pandemic reconstruction of the world. And then we can share further questions or reflections before we wrap up and move on. So, who is Annie Murphy Paul? She is an American science writer, journalist, and public speaker. On top of being a freelance writer, she also serves as a research fellow at New America between 2015 and 19, and at the moment at New America and the Jacobs Foundation. So I found these job titles on her LinkedIn profile. So New America has been nurturing policymakers and public intellectuals since 1999. This community focuses on finding innovative solutions in the field of data science, human centered design, and so on. The Jacobs Foundation, on the other hand, aims at bringing educational technologies and research in brain science to innovate education for the young generation. And before publishing this book, The Extended Mind, Annie Murphy Paul, she also published these two books here. You can find them easily on Amazon, either in the physical book version or Kindle versions. Okay, so this is a little bit about the book. These two passages from the prologue, I think they function as the synopsis of the book. So these are the quote. I'm going to read them aloud because I think they're powerful enough to unpack our discussion for today. This book holds that the mind is something more like the nest building bird I spotted on my walk, plucking a bit of string here, a twig here, constructing a whole out of available parts. So when I was reading this passage, I could not help but visualize her simile with this image here, this little bird and her nest. And let's dig further into how to extend our mind activities to our body. So you can see this passage here again from the prologue. Thinking outside the brain means skillfully engaging entities external to our heads, the feelings and movements of our bodies, the physical spaces in which we learn and work, and the minds of other people around us, drawing them into our own. So these two passages, I hope they're beautiful and powerful enough to open up our further discussion. So, the first part of the book, there are 3 chapters here, and all of them they're about the body and the mind. And you can see that here I chose 2 visuals. This is the meditation pose, and this is what's called your 8 senses. So I am assuming that most of us, we are familiar with our 5 senses. You can see on the top. But here, 3 more sentences are added for, holistically understand who we are. Movement, balance, and interoception. So interoception is actually one key idea in this part. According to Paul, her definition is an awareness of the inner state of our body. So this idea might not be new to you if you are a yoga or meditation practitioner. But she argues that this awareness of body reactions might help even financial analysts to make investment decisions more precisely compared to merely counting on rational analysis. As a math teacher, I need to say, this example sounds really unbelievable to me, as if rationality could be replaced by simply intuition. This is certainly a counterintuitive example to me. Later in this part, she discusses how meditation may guide us to become more sensitive to our body signals. So she calls that as mindfulness meditation. And such sensitivity can lead to higher life satisfaction and, of course, better decision making. She also reminds us that some simple practices can really impact how we learn on a daily basis. So, for example, she advocates for more physical movement during school time, and she encourages teachers to do that as well, or all the stakeholders in a school community. And also she discusses on how gesture can impact the comprehension of speech. So before we move on, here are our guiding or reflection questions for the first part. The first one is, how can we implement body movements and mindfulness practices into our daily teaching, especially in this post-pandemic world? And the second question is related to gesture. To what extent can the use of gesture help ELL students build English skills faster? So again, I'm going to give you 3 minutes to really think through the questions and share with us. So I actually practice a bit with some tips from this book. At some point in this part, she talks about how congruent movements are an effective way to reinforce still tentative or emerging knowledge by introducing a corporeal component into a process of understanding and remembering. And her example in this part was a number line. So she talks about how younger children can move around a line to really consolidate their understanding of a number line. And I adapted this idea to engage with my grade 6 students. Most of them, they're EL students, and we are just learning about some introductory ideas in statistics. So we really use our bodies well to understand outlier, cluster, and gap in the classroom. Okay, let's move on to part 2. Part 2 is all about connections to the environment. And the quote here is about the healing power of nature. So she writes, "It appears to affect us all in the same fashion. Within 20 to 60 seconds of exposure to nature, our heart rate slows, our blood pressure drops, our breathing becomes more regular, and our brain activity becomes more relaxed." Okay, so this quote might be perceived as common sense, but if you put into the context of this book, she compares that to concept mapping. As you can see, this is an example. So concept mapping is a type of spatial thinking, and her understanding of concept mapping is a visual representation of facts and ideas. And also, if you are teaching math like me as well, or if you're teaching elementary school, you might not be unfamiliar with this term or this idea of manipulating real life objects. So you can see that she perceives these three: exposure to the nature, concept mapping, and manipulating real life objects as an essential part of acquiring knowledge. So again, you can see that she's actually quite brilliant in terms of bringing really different ideas together for us to think about the connection to our physical spaces. And I think, to me, I'm more curious about how to use these elements from the nature especially to make students to feel safe, to learn, to fail, and to get help. So again, here is our 1 minute reflection, and I want to really focus on this question right now. How do natural elements contribute to a healthy and safe learning classroom? Okay, thank you for the reflection and sharing. Let's move on to part 3. Oops, to move on. Okay, so part 3, the people and the mind, in my opinion, it really speaks to many of our daily classroom practices. However, this quote might sound contradictory to some popular beliefs nowadays. So, at some point, she writes, imitation permits us to extend to the other some of the familiar regard we feel for ourselves, as well as some of the insight we gain from inhabiting the role of dynamic actor in the world, rather than that of passive observer. Okay, so we actually live in a society that really highlights creativity and innovation. But Paul here, she argues the other way around. She says, well, if we think about children, children actually learn from observing and imitating others' behaviors. So, how do we really bring that imitation, the positive reinforcement of behaviors or acts into our learning? And she tells you that we really need to return to that original state of learning in children. And also, in some part, she discusses social interaction in higher education. So, this is actually quite interesting and quite thought provoking. She uses a physics course to illustrate how top down lectures can be intimidating and unapproachable, even to intelligent university students. Instead, she gives a few counter examples in the same session. In a few post secondary level courses, intense debates and exchanges of knowledge are in place. And in those scenarios, students' engagement is found significantly higher. Unfortunately, though, Paul she points out that social interactions do not exist too much in current university learning setting. So this is something definitely we need to think about how to really prepare students for that before really higher education can be changed. And on top of this lament over the lack of interactions, Paul also highlights that teenagers respond more sensitively to emotional and facial cues. So it is impossible to ignore how emotions, whether positive or negative, may affect how teenagers' minds work. I think we're all familiar with this. Sometimes, in order to really connect with our teenage students, it's not really about how smart we are or how knowledgeable we are. It's really about how sensitive we can be to their emotional needs before they grow academically. And another highlights is to show the power of peers. And she uses the term groupthink and the power of groupthink in business and in education. And again, this is not a new idea because it is similar to collaboration, which is one of the 21st century 4C skills. So the 4C skills are collaboration, communication, critical thinking, and creativity. So, before we move on to some takeaways from this session, I would like to invite you to share how this book or how this discussion so far resonates with you. Do you agree or disagree with her argument and the case studies here, and why? And then let's think about some takeaways before we move on. So, we all understand, as Paul writes in the conclusion, teaching it's highly social and it can change one person powerfully at cognitive and emotional levels. I am assuming that most of us went through distance learning because of the pandemic. And I am wondering how you perceive the role of technology as the replacement of in-person learning. Maybe some of you have become an advocate of technology. Maybe some of you're still hesitant about that, like me. And Paul, in the conclusion, she gives us this quote to reflect on. Aided by technology, we are creating individual, asynchronous, atomized experiences for students and employees, from personalized playlists of academic lessons to go at your own pace online training modules. So, again, interestingly enough, Paul leaves us these comments on personalized learning with the assistance of technology. It sounds kind of contradictory to the rising control or power of technology in the educational landscape or in our daily life right now. However, in the context of this book, such personalization is rather negative because one cannot really extend from thinking within just one mind. On the other hand, though, she provides us with this hopeful alternative. She calls that as transactive memory. And that's her definition of that. It's about explicitly sharing thoughts with other members. We can actually connect that with concept mapping, or personally, I read it as a written version and a collaborative version of Think Aloud. Okay, before we move on, again, I want to give you really 1 minute or maybe longer to think about the final question here. How do we utilize these extended minds or practices in our daily teaching? Okay, thank you for spending your time today here. I wonder if anyone has any questions or reflections. Feel free to turn on the microphone and share with us. And thank you for attending, and I hope to see you in further engagement or exchanges, moments at ties and further. Thank you so much. Bye bye.